My topic today is, well, it's a combination of one thing that I know something about and one thing that I know, nothing really about. The thing I know something about is consciousness, which I've at least spent the last 2 or 3 decades thinking about in many of its different aspects in science and philosophy and so on. The thing I know less about is moral status, which is really a topic in ethics. When I got started in philosophy, I more or less swore that I was never going to really get into ethics. I just thought, what expertise do I have in thinking about questions in ethics? Really very little. So I thought I could leave that to somebody else. But you know how it is in philosophy. You think about one thing and it connects to another 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 thing. And before long, you're thinking about almost everything. You get inexorably drawn to other topics. And over the years, I guess one of the latest iterations of that sort for me is getting drawn to questions about ethics and about value. And one of the potential connections here is that many people think is at least a tempting thesis that somehow consciousness is the ground or the source of all real value in life. Value, meaning, the difference between good and bad all somehow come from consciousness. I've got some sneaking sympathy with that thesis. I'm not going to be defending anything nearly as broad in the limited time we have today, but I'm just going to look at the connection between consciousness and one aspect. I'm going to look at one kind of connection between consciousness and one aspect of value, which is moral status. Okay, so let me now share my screen and say something about these things in a bit more detail. Okay, share screen. Let me just go back to the basic mode. Keynote there. Share. Okay, that's that now sharing properly. Let me go for play here. Okay, hopefully that's working. You getting the full screen? Yep. Okay, so consciousness and moral status. So what is moral status? Roughly speaking, a being has moral status if it matters morally, if it matters in moral decisions for its own sake. If it's a creature whose existence and interests we have to take into account in making moral decisions for its own sake. So, the paradigm case would be humans, human beings seem to have moral status. We've got to treat other human beings with moral respect, take them into account in the moral decisions we make. Don't harm them needlessly, and so on. But it's widely agreed that not just humans have moral status. For example, most people think that that dogs and other non-human animals have some sort of moral status, perhaps not as much as humans have. Perhaps they don't matter as much as humans do, but they still have some kind of moral status. At the same time, it's widely believed there are some beings that don't have, some objects that don't have moral status. So a cup, for example, maybe a perfectly fine cup, but we don't really need to take this cup into account in our moral decisions for its own sake. Maybe if somebody really cares about the cup, we should not destroy the cup and so on. But it's not as if we have to respect the cup's own interests. At least that's the standard view of these matters. So cups don't have moral status. There's a relevant distinction here between full and partial moral status, where roughly a human being has full moral status and maybe a dog has partial moral status. A being has full moral status to a first approximation if it matters in moral decisions for its own sake as much as ordinary humans do. For example, think about the Black Lives Matter movement. In the Black Lives Matter movement, what's at stake is that, the claim that Black lives matter as much as any human life does. That is, that Black lives have full moral status. By comparison, one can also talk about partial moral status. You can say a being has partial moral status if it matters in moral decisions for its own sake to any extent. So you do sometimes hear about, for example, an animal lives matter. movement. And in that movement, I take it the claim is not that animal lives matter as much as human lives matter, but just that they matter to some extent. They matter to some degree. So there the claim is that animals have partial moral status. Here I'll be talking about both full and partial moral status, although I think the central cases are going to involve something like full moral status. So as soon as you raise this issue of moral status, it raises any number of questions. Which beings have moral status? In virtue of what does a being have moral status? And what is the relationship between consciousness and moral status? And the reason I'm giving this talk is I'm inclined to think there is some relationship between consciousness and moral status. And such a connection is really quite widely endorsed in the literature on moral status and on consciousness. So here's a view that's become quite popular and is quite widely discussed. It often goes by the name sentientism. Sentientism says that a being has moral status if and only if it is sentient, or at least there's an only if claim, and quite often an if and only if claim. All sentient beings have moral status. No non-sentient beings have moral status. And I'll say a bit more about what sentience is just in a second. But this view is often held to be attractive because it gets to have a broad scope. Here's an article from a couple of years ago. Humanism needs an upgrade. Sentientism. Humanism is just like, it's human value that's really at the ground of all value. Sentientism says, no, we've got to go beyond humans. And this little picture here gives you a sense as to how maybe beings which have value include all sentient beings, which might include humans, might also include, say, some pigs, some non-human animals, perhaps could eventually include some robots, some artificially intelligent creatures, if they're sentient. And I take it this fourth picture here is maybe a picture of a Martian or some non-earthly creature. And the thought is, as long as they're sentient, they matter morally. So not just humans, but all sentient creatures. Okay, so then you may ask, what then is sentience? Well, here's a quote from Richard Ryder, who is the thinker, the animal rights activist who introduced the term sentientism back in 1990. Incidentally, Ryder is also the same person that introduced the term speciesism, which has gone on to be very influential. And when he, in the article introducing sentientism, he put a lot of weight on consciousness. He said, consciousness is of paramount importance to all of us. By definition, it's the universe of our awareness. On the assumption that many other species are conscious or sentient, I've suggested our morality is based upon a concern for all sentience, which I have called sentientism. He says, I could equally have called it consciousism, but that's even more horrible as a word. So let's call it sentientism. And he says, pain and pleasure are the two great poles of consciousness between which all sentience swing, striving to gain one and avoid the other. So here, there's two strands here, and even in this original article by Ryder. One is putting weight on consciousness, and second is putting specific weight on pain and pleasure. And both of these strands are relevant to what I'll discuss here. It gives rise to a distinction between what I call broad and narrow sentientism. Roughly, the thought is the following. One understanding of sentience just equates sentience with consciousness or conscious experience. And the other understanding of sentience equates it with something like affective consciousness. Pain versus pleasure, states with an affective valence. And you get different versions of sentientism depending on how you make that, on how you understand sentience here. So this is the distinction between broad and narrow sentientism. Okay, so broad sentientism says a being has moral status if and only if it has the capacity for phenomenal consciousness. Okay, so I'll now say a little bit more about what phenomenal consciousness or just consciousness is. Phenomenal consciousness, which I take to be the core kind of consciousness. Philosophers just sometimes put the word phenomenal in front to distinguish it from other meanings of the word. But a being is phenomenally conscious if there's something it's like to be that being. And here the idea is there's something it's like to be me right now. I'm having visual and auditory experiences. There's something it's like to be me from the inside. I take it there's something it's like to be you too. This phrase goes back at least to an article by my colleague Tom Nagel back in 1974 called What Is It Like to Be a Bat? Where the key idea was, well, it's awfully hard to know what it's like to be a bat for us. You know, this bat which is using sonar and sending out little beeps into the environment and using echolocation. What's that like for the bat? Is it like seeing? Is it like hearing? Well, we really don't know, but presumably there's something it's like to be a bat. And if there's something it's like to be a bat, that's just to say the bat is conscious. It has conscious experience. So typically we think humans are conscious, bats are conscious, but cups are probably not conscious. On the standard view, there's nothing it's like to be a cup. So then we say a being is phenomenally conscious if there's something it's like to be that being. And the state of the mind is phenomenally conscious if there's something it's like to be in that state. So when I see the cup, for example, well, there's something it's like for me to see the cup. It feels like something. I've experienced certain colors and shapes and so on. Likewise, conscious emotion, conscious thinking, there's something it's like to be in those states, but maybe some processing deep in my brainstem, there may be nothing it's like for me to be in that state. It doesn't reach my consciousness. Okay, so that's phenomenal consciousness. And broad sentientism says a being has moral status if and only if it has the capacity for phenomenal consciousness. That is, there's something it's like to be that being, or at least it has that capacity. I mean, maybe when we're asleep, we're temporarily not conscious, but we still have the capacity for a consciousness, so we still count as sentient. We still have moral status. So that's broad sentientism. That's actually a thesis with which I'm reasonably sympathetic. Now, as a matter of fact, in the literature on sentientism, it's much more often been understood as the thesis I will call narrow sentientism. And narrow sentientism makes a more specific claim. Narrow sentientism says a being has moral status if and only if it has the capacity for affective phenomenal consciousness. And here, affective phenomenal consciousness is a particular kind of phenomenal consciousness. It's a conscious experience that involves affect, positive or negative affect. So what affective phenomenal consciousness involves conscious states with a positive or negative affective valence. So, paradigms of affective phenomenal states would be pleasure on the one hand and pain on the other. Pleasure is positive, pain is negative. But this doesn't limit, this doesn't exhaust the space of affective states. There are many. Positively valent states might include pleasure, but also the experience of satisfaction or happiness or fulfillment. Negatively valenced conscious states include the experience of pain, but also the inclusion of frustration, of suffering, of grief, and other forms of sadness, and so on. So there's many, many different positively and negatively valent states. I'm going to count them all as affective states. And insofar as they're conscious, so far as you experience that positive and negative valence, then they're affective states. So narrow sentientism says the being has moral status if and only if it has the capacity for affective phenomenal consciousness. This has actually in some ways been the more influential claim within this sentientist tradition. So my own views are the following. I am quite sympathetic with broad sentientism, the claim that a being has moral status if and only if it's conscious. I'm very unsympathetic with the more common claim of narrow sentientism, that a being has moral status if and only if it has the capacity for affective consciousness. So I'm going to explore both of those things in what follows. I'm going to fairly briefly explore broad sentientism and then go on to focus on narrow sentientism, offering some thought experiments and some analysis to explore each. And along the way, hopefully, you'll be able to come to some views about where you think the roots of moral status here might be. Okay, let me start with broad sentientism. This view again says a being has moral status if and only if it has the capacity for phenomenal consciousness, or at least only if it has the capacity for phenomenal consciousness. No phenomenal consciousness, if there's nothing it's like to be you and you don't have that capacity, then you don't have moral status. I mean, there's different ways to get at this thesis here. Some intuitive ways to get at it. Well, one central intuition is that consciousness matters greatly for well-being. The kind of for making our lives go better or worse. It's clear that how things are in our consciousness at least can make a great difference to our well-being, and it's a widely held intuition that consciousness may be required for well-being. There's a useful thought experiment here, actually first put forward by Charles Seward, which is the thought experiment of zombification. Here the question is, would you be willing to lose your consciousness entirely and forever? Would you be willing, that is, to be turned into a philosophical zombie? Philosophical zombies are interesting creatures. Here's a picture of a philosophical here's a definition of a philosophical zombie. A philosophical zombie is a being that seems like a normal human, but doesn't have conscious experiences, sense experiences, quality. It basically doesn't have phenomenal consciousness, a being that acts and behaves and maybe has a physical makeup like a human being, but there's nothing it's like to be that being. Don't take this slide too seriously. It was the best I could find on the web, but this particular creature doesn't seem to be behaving very much like a normal human. This is much more like a movie zombie wandering around and eating people's brains. Philosophical zombies look from the outside a fair amount like normal humans, but lack consciousness entirely. The extreme case of a philosophical zombie is a physical duplicate of normal humans without consciousness. Philosophers debate those. I've talked about those sometimes. For present purposes, we may not need anything quite so strong. Just think about a being which is as much like a human being as possible, but lacks all phenomenal consciousness. And then the question is, this thought experiment is, would you be willing to be turned into a philosophical zombie, lose consciousness entirely? And most people's intuition is, no, that would be a very bad thing to happen. If I stopped having any conscious experience of vision and of hearing and of pleasure and of pain, and so on, even if my behavior and so on stayed the same, that would not be a good thing to happen to me. I would not be willing for this to happen. So that suggests that consciousness matters greatly for our well-being. And many people have the intuition that if we turned into zombies, we would, then nothing would matter to us anymore. We'd have no well-being whatsoever, in which case it looks like consciousness is required for well-being. Okay, so that's one kind of thought experiment. The philosopher Charles Seward has discussed cases like that. But here I want to do it in moral terms, not just in terms of personal well-being. And in moral terms, I think it's useful to combine this zombie thought experiment with another thought experiment. This is the thought experiment known as the trolley problem. Now, I'm sure those of you who've taken some philosophy classes may have encountered the trolley problem. Those of you who've watched the TV series, The Good Place, may have also come across the trolley problem when at one point, one of the main characters, Chidi, finds himself at the helm of a trolley going down these tracks and has the choice between killing one person on this track or, going straight and killing 5 people or switching tracks and just killing one person. That's the dilemma of the trolley problem. So here you are, you're the person controlling the switch. The trolley is going straight. If you do nothing, it will kill 5 people. If you flip the switch, it'll kill one person. And philosophers debate this case. But I think the dominant view is that it's permissible and perhaps obligatory to switch the lever and kill, save 5 lives and sacrifice 1, saving more people. Overall, a good thing to do. And most people think the right thing to do. Anyway, that's the standard trolley problem, which is very interesting in its own right. But for getting at the connection between consciousness and value, I'm going to now introduce a mashup of the zombie thought experiment with the trolley problem thought experiment, this is what I call the zombie trolley problem. Okay, this is the best picture I could find of a zombie trolley problem on the web. It's not completely accurate for my purposes. It indicates a bunch of Hollywood-style zombies coming up a railroad track towards you with, is that a train in there lurking in the background? But here is actually how the zombie trolley problem goes. On one track, you have one conscious human being. On the other track, you have 5 philosophical zombies, very much like human beings, but lacking any conscious experience whatsoever. So track 1, 1 conscious human. Track 2, 5 philosophical zombies. And the situation is such that the trolley will either kill all those on track 1, or either kill the conscious human on track 1, or to kill the 5 zombies on track 2. Remember, in the case where they're all ordinary conscious humans, most people have the intuition, kill the 1, save the 5. But what about this case, where the 1 is conscious and the 5 are not? They're zombies. What then do you choose? Well, okay, think about that one for a moment. What would you do in this circumstance? I think in this case, there's a common, at least, intuition in thinking about this case, although not a universal one. I haven't done careful experimental philosophy on this with surveys to find the numbers. But I think it's a very common reaction to say, in this case, it's still an unfortunate dilemma to be in, but given the unfortunate choices, preferable to kill the 5 zombies. Why? Because they're not conscious beings. They matter less than a conscious human does. An extreme view would say they're not conscious, nothing has meaning or value to them, so they're not even in the moral sphere. But in any case, this intuition can at least bring out that for many people, zombies seem to matter less. If you do go that way, that you should kill the 5 zombies rather than the one conscious human, we can then maybe come up with more extreme versions of this case to get at some of the underlying issues. For example, here's one extreme version of the case. On track 1, we have 1 conscious chicken. On track 2, we have a planet full of humanoid zombies. So the chicken is conscious, it experiences pain, pleasure, vision, and so on. The humanoid zombies are very sophisticated, but they don't consciously experience anything at all. Then you've got the choice of killing the chicken or killing the planet of zombies. What should you choose? I think different people have different intuitions here, and different reactions are reasonable. I have certainly come across people who say, save the chicken, it's conscious, therefore it has a life that matters. Kill the planet of zombies, none of them are conscious, so they don't matter in the same way. So if that's your choice, kill the planet of humanoid zombies, then it seems like that brings out the intuition that non-conscious beings don't matter. Only conscious beings matter. No, I confess I waver on this myself. I certainly have the intuition that non-conscious beings matter less, but nonetheless, it's possible to feel some sympathy even for zombies, who are very sophisticated creatures, even if they're not conscious. And I think plenty of people still here have the intuition that maybe you should save the planet of humanoid zombies, even though they're not conscious, and sacrifice the chicken. If that's your reaction, then things beside consciousness matter at least a bit. And that would lead you to a view where consciousness matters, but some other properties matter too, like say the great sophistication of these zombies might make their lives matter to some extent. Anyway, I'm not going to try and settle this question here about the zombie trolley problem. If you do think that consciousness, the things other than consciousness matter, we can also go all the way to the parity version, where on track 1, there's 1 conscious being. On track 2, there's 1 philosophical zombie. And ask the question, what should you do? I think the dominant reaction here is to say, save the conscious being and kill the zombie, because the conscious being has a life that matters more. If that's your reaction, that suggests consciousness matters at least a bit. If you're torn, you think, okay, kill one, kill the other, it doesn't matter. Then that brings out, that seems to reflect an underlying view that consciousness doesn't matter at all. I suspect that view is a relatively uncommon one, but again, we need to get stats about all these cases to understand intuitive views about this in the population. My own verdicts about all these cases, I guess I'd say in the parity case, I'm pretty clear, save the conscious being. Consciousness certainly matters. Even in the 5-to-1 case, I'm inclined to say save the conscious being. And conscious beings have lives which are somehow in a realm of value that zombies just don't attain. But the extreme case, the zombie versus the planet of humanoid zombies, I'm at least somewhat unclear. I think, you could make a case that zombies have some value, in which case they may be sources of value independent of consciousness. Anyway, this is a bunch of difficult intuitions. I'm not claiming any of this is decisive here, but this is just getting onto the table that basic connection between consciousness and value and different ways you can go. And, my own verdicts here lean towards consciousness as the ground, as at least a primary ground of value. But I think, there's a lot more to be said here. The upshot of all this, at least given views like mine, is that consciousness matters a lot in moral decisions. It may or may not be absolutely required for moral status. There's an intuitive case then for broad sentientism, but it's not entirely cut and dried. And it could be that features beyond phenomenal consciousness, like intelligence or intentionality or meaning, also matter to some extent. I'm not going to try and settle that case here today. Instead, I want to move on to the question of narrow sentientism, where, at least speaking for myself, I have much clearer views about this matter, which I want to explore in what follows. So remember, narrow sentientism was the thesis that says a being has moral status if and only if it has the capacity for affective phenomenal consciousness, or affective phenomenal consciousness, experiences with positive and negative valence, like pain and pleasure. So this is a very common view in the history of moral philosophy, going way back to Jeremy Bentham, one of the original founders of utilitarianism. In 1789, he wrote, in talking about non-human animals and their moral status, he said, "The question is not, can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer?" It's the capacity for suffering, a certain kind of affective phenomenal consciousness that Bentham thought is what really matters morally. You find the same view in much more recent theorists. Here's Peter Singer, one of your previous Philosophy Day lecturers, from his book, Animal Liberation in 1975. He really put the focus on affect. He said, "The capacity for suffering and enjoying things is a prerequisite for having interests at all. A stone doesn't have interests because it cannot suffer. Nothing that we can do to it could possibly make any difference to its welfare. A mouse, on the other hand, does have an interest in not being tormented because it will suffer if it is. This is why the limit of sentience, using the term as a convenient, if not strictly accurate, shorthand for the capacity to suffer or experience enjoyment or happiness," he says, that capacity is the only defensible boundary of concern for the interests of others. I like the parenthesis here, by the way, because here he's conceding that, yes, in ordinary language, sentience doesn't just refer, I think, to pain versus pleasure, enjoyment versus suffering, not just to affective consciousness. We would normally take sentience to mean something much, much broader that involves at least consciousness more generally. But Singer, like others in this tradition, is using sentience for the more narrow capacity for affective consciousness and saying that's the only defensible boundary of concern for the interests of others. Okay, so now I want to get at this case, this thesis, narrow sentientism, by a different thought experiment. I used the thought experiment of zombies to explore broad sentientism. To explore narrow sentientism in a corresponding way, Here, the relevant thought experiment is one involving Vulcans. Now, the Vulcans are inspired by the Vulcans of Star Trek, who we'll get to in a second, although they've got a certain autonomy from what happens in Star Trek itself. I mean, okay, here's a picture of Mr. Spock from the original Star Trek series back in the 1960s. There were many Vulcans in Star Trek since then. And what's paradigmatic of Vulcans is they don't experience emotion or affect, at least for the most part. I mean, it's tricky. Mr. Spock is half human and half Vulcan, so he certainly seems to have his share of affect. And every few years, they go through a period of lust where they have extreme affect for a brief period. So they're not extreme. None of these are perfect affectless beings. But the Vulcans I'm stipulating are hypothetical beings that are phenomenally conscious, but lack the capacity for affective consciousness entirely. They perceive, they think, they act, they're conscious. There's something it's like for them to see, something it's like for them to think, something it's like for them to act. But they do not experience pain, pleasure, happiness, or suffering. Never any positive affect, never any negative affect. Their affective life is always at the neutral baseline. And the thought is that, that Vulcans from Star Trek are at least an approximation in this direction, but they probably have some affect. So the Vulcans I'm talking about are more extreme. Another non-fictional case to get a grip on this is certain syndromes or disorders which involve diminishment or elimination of affect in real human beings. So there's a phenomenon called pain asymbolia, where patients are given certain drugs, for example, like morphine, and then they say, well, I still feel the pain, but it no longer hurts. They get all the sensory quality of a pain, but none of the affective quality. The negative affect has just gone away. So that's asymbolia. There's also anhedonia, which is the inability to experience pleasure. Woody Allen actually talks about anhedonia in his movie Annie Hall, which was originally going to be called anhedonia. And it's quite a common syndrome, especially in people with depression, at least a diminishment of experiencing pleasure. Extreme anhedonia is the inability to experience pleasure at all. So you might think of Vulcans as having extreme asymbolia and anhedonia, but for all extreme versions of these, no affect whatsoever, and versions of them for all affective phenomena. As far as I know, I don't know if there are any human beings that lack affect entirely, but it seems, at least as a thought experiment, we don't have too much trouble making sense of this. And that's what I mean by a Vulcan. Now, Vulcans, unlike zombies, needn't be functional duplicates of ordinary human beings. They don't experience pleasure, so it's unlikely they're going to perform the kinds of actions that we take to be motivated by pleasure. Like, not going to be so much reason for a Vulcan to go in for fine food, at least with pleasure as a motivation. And the sensory pleasures in general won't be big motivators for them. So they won't be motivated by pleasure. They won't display emotional reactions driven by affect. But I take it they can still have goals and projects. Vulcans like Mr. Spock might well be interested in advancing science and helping those around them. They might be motivated to do those things. They may even be motivated sometimes by self-interest. It's not at all clear you need affect for motivation. Those things are quite separable. I'll come back to this, though, in more detail in a moment. Anyway, so Vulcans are conscious beings, goals and projects, but no affect. So few of us would choose to become Vulcans, I think. It seems that Vulcans live quite an impoverished conscious life compared to our own. Their lives are probably not as interesting in some respects as ours. But still, the question now is not would we choose to become Vulcans, but do they in fact have moral status? And to get at that, here the relevant thought experiment is a Vulcan trolley problem. Replace the zombies in the previous thought experiment with Vulcans. So here's the closest I could find to a Vulcan trolley. It's a train with a picture of Spock on it. Okay, so down the track, there's a trolley coming down the track. On one track, it'll kill one ordinary conscious human being. On the other track, it will kill 5 Vulcans, all of whom are conscious, but they lack affective consciousness, no pleasure or pain. So what will you do? Here it is. Here are the options laid out. On track 1, one ordinary conscious human being. On track 2, 5 Vulcans who are conscious but lack affective consciousness. What should you do? What will you do? Okay, take a moment to think about that. Or even, let's move to an extreme version, because this is what's relevant for the thesis. Suppose you can save an hour's drive. You're on your way home. There's a lot of traffic, but you can escape the traffic by killing a Vulcan. Is it permissible to kill a Vulcan to save an hour's drive on the way home? Remembering this Vulcan is conscious but lacks affective consciousness. Okay, think about that. Here are my verdicts. First verdict about the Vulcan trolley problem: one should not kill 5 Vulcans to save a human. Those Vulcans are conscious and their lives matter. Furthermore, I think it would be monstrous to kill a Vulcan to save an hour's travel home. That would just be an entirely monstrous thing to do. Why? Vulcans are conscious, they're conscious beings, their lives matter. Their lives matter, and to me, intuitively at least, their lives seem to matter roughly as much as human lives do. The fact that they don't experience pain and pleasure may impoverish their conscious lives to some extent, but it doesn't make their lives matter any less. Given that, if I'm right about this, that Vulcans, if their lives matter, they have moral status, even though they lack the capacity for affective consciousness, it just follows that narrow sentientism is false. It's not true that beings have moral status, if and only if they have the capacity for affective consciousness. Vulcans will be a counterexample. Okay, so far, this is an intuitive argument analogous to the one about zombies. And you might say, well, the intuitions here are shaky and not entirely clear. We don't want to rest the argument just on those. I think at least in this case, we can turn the argument into a more serious argument that goes beyond just intuition by putting it forward in the form of a dilemma. And in this case, for this dilemma, I'll hypothesize a being, instead of a being with no affective valence, like a Vulcan, let's consider a being with tiny positive and negative valence. It has very mild pains, very mild pleasures, but a very narrow affective range. And the question is, how much do beings like that matter? And it seems there are roughly 2 options here. One is their lives matter about as much as ordinary humans do. Now, then the upshot of that is you've got a massive discontinuity, where a tiny difference between Vulcans and these beings with a very narrow affective range makes a huge moral difference. And it's just hard to see how that tiny difference could somehow turn all the moral lights on from 0 to mattering as much as a human. That's massive discontinuity. The alternative is to say, well, there's a spectrum here, and maybe a being like that matters a fraction as much as ordinary humans do. Well, that view has the consequence, it seems, that people with a wide affective range matter more than people with a narrow affective range. And, we all know people with very wide affective range who experience very strong joys and intense suffering. And we all know people with a much narrower affective range. To me, the thesis that those people with wide affective range, their lives deserve to be, say, saved more, they matter morally more than those with narrow affective range, seems somewhat monstrous to me as well, that somehow, you should kill, for example, 10 beings with narrow affective range before one being with 10 times wider wide affective range. That also seems a bizarre view. So I think the person that maintains that Vulcans don't matter is going to have some very sticky consequences to attend to here, although perhaps there are things that can be said. Okay, so there's an argument for the view that Vulcans matter and that narrow sentientism, therefore, is false. There's a few objections you might make. One objection is to say Vulcans matter only the way forests matter, or jungles. You know, they're beautiful and complex and so on. We shouldn't destroy them because of that, but they don't have interests of their own. So yeah, maybe there's a sense in which you should save the jungle, even though it lacks moral status. In response to this, I guess I'm just inclined to say, after making the distinction between these different ways of mattering, yes, there's a sense in which jungles matter different from the way in which humans matter. I'm inclined to say Vulcans matter the way that humans matter, for their own sake, not just the way that forests matter. The second objection is there's something very incoherent about the very idea of a Vulcan. Maybe Vulcans are inconceivable or impossible because non-affective conscious states are entirely impossible. I'm very dubious about this. Like, for a start, much ordinary perception and thought seems to be insignificantly affective on a standard view of affect. Affect is involved in some of our mental states, but not all of them. Furthermore, it's also part of the standard view of affect that valence can be positive and can be negative and can be neutral. And where you have positive and negative, it's just theoretically plausible. There's a neutral point on pretty much all the current models of affect. There is such a neutral point. So there's nothing inconceivable about affectively neutral conscious states. Vulcans are just beings for whom all their states are that way. If that's right, then this objection won't get too much purchase, at least not without a whole lot of further argument. Maybe one of the most interesting objections is that, even though Vulcans are conceivable, they would lack some mental capacities which are absolutely crucial for moral status. So, you might say they lack care, they don't care about anything, they lack interests, they lack reasons, they lack values. But maybe the paradigm case of something that some people want to say they lack is desires. Like, Vulcans don't really genuinely want anything. Why? Because affect is required for desires. Vulcans don't have affect, so they don't have desires, and because of that, they don't have interests at all, and they don't matter. So one way you might get this view going is to say that desire requires feelings of pleasure or satisfaction upon achieving the object of the desire, or maybe in anticipation of the object of the desire. When I eat the food, I enjoy it, or when I think about eating the food, I have some positive anticipation. On some views of desires, without that affective element, you wouldn't really have desires at all. So Vulcans lack desires. No, I'm dubious about this view of desires. I think at the very least, it's clear that Vulcans can have motivation. They can have the motivation to pursue science, to help others, maybe even to help themselves. They seem to have goals. They're motivated to perform certain actions when they think this will achieve certain outcomes. There's no reason why lack of affect stops those things from happening. And that's the standard functional profile of desires, of having a goal or a plan or a desire, at least as philosophers typically think about desires. If so, Vulcans have desires. You might say there's one view in which motivation requires affect. You say that Vulcans could not even be motivated, maybe could not even act without affect. And here there's an echo maybe of David Hume's view that all motivation requires passions. And exactly what a passion amounts to in Hume is somewhat ambiguous between something like a desire and something like a positive emotion. But there's at least a view where somehow all motivation has to be grounded in positive emotion. I think that second stronger claim is implausible. And in fact, if you look at contemporary affective neuroscience, the best current science of affect, it's standard to distinguish states of wanting, which are motivational states, from states of liking, which are affective states. And it's generally held that each of these can happen without the other. And in fact, there's nothing incoherent about motivation without affect. So if that's right, Vulcans can have motivation, and there's no problem there. You might hold that valuing requires affect. Vulcans act and are motivated, but they don't desire anything or care about anything because that requires more than mere motivation. This is a complex matter, but I say Vulcans at least say they value certain goals and pursue those goals because they're important. They live their lives accordingly. Should we disbelieve them? I mean, that seems odd to me. So my view of this matter here, it gets very interesting, these issues about desire and affect. I guess my view is there are both affect-laden and non-affect-laden desires. There's what we might call Humean desires, inspired by David Hume's view, or affective desires, those grounded in affect, goals pursued because of pleasure. But we also have Kantian or non-affective desires, those not grounded in affect, but for example, in a judgment that certain outcomes are good. And maybe this is closer to Kant's model of moral psychology, although of course Kant's model is very complicated. I don't want to make any claims in this area where I don't have much expertise. A distinction like this has been made by others in the literature. For example, a nice article by Melinda Vedas on affective and non-affective desires. I'm inclined to say at the very least, a Vulcan can have non-affective desires, which is good enough for present purposes. Vulcans may lack then Humean desires, but they still have these Kantian desires. And I think Kantian desires are about as morally significant as Humean desires in providing reasons, interests, moral status. Even if you insist that they aren't genuine desires, maybe you say, let's call them schmazires instead of desires, I think it still seems monstrous to kill a conscious being who has these Kantian desires. Anyway, so this is just a little sideline about some complicated issues about the relationship between affect and desire. Maybe I'll skip the case of the weather watches because time is running low. Okay, so I guess the upshot of all this then is that I think affect, it can make lives better, it can make lives worse for sure. Pain makes lives worse, pleasure makes lives better, but it's not what makes lives matter in the first place. Affectless Vulcans matter morally just about as much as affective humans. So although phenomenal consciousness may be required for moral status, I think affective consciousness is not, which means even if broad sentientism is true, narrow sentientism is not. Okay, so I'm just about done. You could raise the question of what is the relationship between consciousness and value more generally. For example, is consciousness necessary for well-being or for personal value, for having, value in one's own life? My own tentative view here would be that perhaps consciousness is necessary for value, including well-being. But again, affective consciousness is not. Vulcans can have well-being and can live valuable lives, even in the absence of affect. So again, I would just strongly reject any view that puts affective consciousness, such as pain and pleasure, at the roots of all value and well-being. There remains one extremely interesting question, which is to explain why consciousness is valuable. If indeed it is the source of valuable, what is it that makes it valuable? And what is it that indeed makes it uniquely valuable? Alas, I seem to have run out of time, so I will leave this for you as a homework exercise. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you so much, David. That was a fascinating 45 minutes for 50 minutes or so. Okay, now I do have some questions already lined up. And while you answer the first couple of questions, I'm going to monitor the chat and see what else comes up. I would say let's go on for about 10 minutes or so, if you're okay.
Sure.
Okay.
I'm happy to go on.
Sounds good. All right. So the first question that I have on my list it's about your description of Vulcans, actually. This comes from Matten. Isn't that description of Vulcans a bit inconsistent? If they don't experience any valence, what does it mean for them to actually be motivated to do something?
To be motivated is, at the very least, they have a tendency to do those things. Some things that we do are grounded in affect, like liking those things. But think about your standard Kantian moral agent, form some judgments. Oh, yes, that is the right thing to do. Therefore, I will do it. I think standardly, you can think about this, even in the absence of any positive feeling towards that action, such as some state of pleasure or satisfaction. You just do it because it's the right thing to do. You have motivation but you don't have affect. The way I'm thinking about these Vulcans, that's how much of their motivation is. They have desires, they have goals, but they have no affect. So, and I think the affective neuroscience tends to support this picture by having these wanting states that tend to produce certain actions, often even in the absence of the liking state, which is a positive feeling about those actions.
I guess there's a question that is actually related to that. So I'm going to jump a little here and there because it makes more sense to me to ask the next question, which is from this next question, which comes from Alexandros. How exactly can we separate consciousness between affective and non-affective consciousness? Pain and suffering are certainly affective, but what about thoughts and dreams? It seems to me that even these necessitate affect. And so what exactly is a non-affective conscious state? And how do we separate it from affective ones? Or alternatively, what do you mean by affective? In other words, it seems to be, several people seem to have a little bit of a difficulty here separating affective from non-affective consciousness.
So the affective one, the idea is these are the ones at the neutral baseline of affect. And we all intuitively, there's positive affective states, which we have accompanied by some kind of positive feeling. And there's negative affective states accompanied by some kind of negative feeling. And what I'm calling a non-affective state, we could also call a neutrally affective state, intuitively one of those ones at the 0 point. And I don't know about you, but many of my ordinary day-to-day conscious states I take to be somewhere around the 0 point. Ordinary, say, visual perception. I look at a nondescript scene. I may have no particular affect. I'm thinking about some mundane thing I have to do. I may have no particular affect. In some cases, I may have positive or negative affect, but I think it's also just a familiar part of phenomenology. We have that neural baseline. So that's what I'm thinking of as a non-affective state. And Vulcans will be beings, all of whose states are like that.
All right. Michael is asking, does something with moral status have to be conscious or sentient at all? Say there was a rare plant or a tree that could cure cancer, for instance. Wouldn't the tree contain more moral status than a cup or even a sentient chicken? Or is it that the tree just considered valuable to beings that do have moral status? That's actually a broader way of asking the same question, is even independent of the case of a plant having value because it can cure cancer. A lot of people seem to think that the environment in general or species in general have a moral status of sorts because we're supposed to be protecting them, preserving them, etc. But it doesn't seem to be an issue of consciousness there.
Yeah, I mean, in the case of the plant that can cure cancer, if it's the fact that they can cure cancer, that's the crucial point, then this looks like a case of not of it mattering morally for its own sake, but of it's mattering morally for someone else's sake, for the sake, for example, of the people whose cancer it can cure. So that'd be the kind of thing philosophers call instrumental moral status, mattering for some other being rather than intrinsic moral status. Now, you could take the view, and there is the view out there, certainly in environmental ethics, that the environment has not just instrumental moral status, but intrinsic, but some kind of intrinsic moral status. The environment doesn't just matter because of how it affects us. It matters in its own right. I think then some people would draw the distinction between two different kinds of intrinsic moral status, the ones kind of grounded in your own interests and some that are not. This kind of gets at the point I made about the jungle. The Vulcans matter just in the way that, say, the jungle matters. Zombies matter just in the way that the jungle matters, or matter in the way that humans matter. And then I was inclined to say they seem to matter in the way that humans matter. But I didn't mean to be denying at this point that there might not be some way in which, say, the jungle matters in its own right. I just think perhaps one could tease apart the way in which jungles and non-conscious entities matter from the way in which humans matter.
Okay. An earlier question by Tanya was a little bit broader, but I think it's interesting. It's like all of this seems to be predicated on the notion, of course, of human values. But what do human values themselves stand on in your opinion? I mean, it's like, why are we having this discussion in the first place, I guess?
Yeah.
One way to do it.
The phrase human value is ambiguous between probably many things, but at least two things. One, the sense in which humans have value. And second, the sense in which humans value things. Of course, those two things may be connected. why do we think humans have value? Because we value humans. That is because humans value humans. So in this talk, I haven't said anything at all much about what makes certain things value, what makes humans valuable, what makes consciousness valuable. This picture is consistent with quite different kind of meta-ethical or meta-value pictures of the source of value. It could be that, for example, even consciousness is value fundamentally because we value it. And then that would come down to a question of the source of human values. On a more objective picture, maybe the one that, say, Derek Parfit favored, it's like, no, consciousness has value in its own right. Pain is bad, whether or not anyone ever values it or disvalues it. In this picture, I've tried to be neutral on that. But if you do have the thesis that all value comes contingently from what humans happen to value, then there would have to be presumably some kind of evolutionary story to be told about how it is that we come to value consciousness and such states. I haven't done that here, but it's a really interesting project.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I was thinking about along evolutionary lines as well. Ekin is asking the following question. Kant said that we ought not to harm animals because this practice makes us invariably less sensitive to our moral obligations when it comes to people. So they're normalizing the act, right? So how ought we consider those espousing Kant's rationale that exempting moral harm to non-conscious philosophical zombies, or say some functional isomorph like commanded data, another reference to Star Trek, is immoral not because it exacts pain to those individuals, but just because it makes us into worse human beings.
I'm not sure I got the key point about Kant at the.
Well, let's see the way that Eric put it, and I think it's correct actually, but I might have read it a little too fast. Kant said that we ought not to harm animals.
These questions in the chat, by the way.
Yes, it is, because this practice makes us invariably less sensitive to our moral obligations when it comes to people. In other words, right? So Kant didn't necessarily think that that animals themselves have in themselves have moral value, but to make even an animal suffer or that makes you less sensitive toward other human beings.
So on this view, it's like animals don't really have intrinsic moral status. They at best have some kind of instrumental moral status. Don't harm them because harming them will tend to lead to harm to humans, which is bad. Whereas I guess I would endorse the view that animals have some kind of intrinsic moral status. They value independently of their effect. They value independently of those connections to humans. So then the question is, I guess, but could this view be right for zombies? Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me. I think that's interesting. It wouldn't surprise me at all if some view like this could be right for zombies, as in don't harm zombies, not because they have intrinsic value, because if you harm them, you may be more likely to harm humans. This issue comes up in video games. There are non-player characters who are the subject of all kinds of violence in video games. And some people take the worry that, no, you should not harm shoot, say, for example, non-player characters in video games, because this may translate to the way you harm, ordinary humans in non-virtual reality. Now, as far as I know, there's actually no evidence that transfer goes through. So a lot of people think maybe it's okay to harm non-player characters as long as it doesn't, and it won't transfer, but it's at least a contingent question. And yeah, there is, I take it the point here is that there's always the possibility that performing certain harmful behaviors may extend to effects that go beyond that action. So I think we at least need to be careful about this. And there's a potential rationale for why one shouldn't harm zombies. In the case of Vulcans, though, I'm inclined to say, again, they matter for more than that instrumental reason. I think they matter intrinsically.
Okay. Stephanie says, do different conscious beings have more moral status than others? For instance, an immoral person, a murderer, pedophile, or something like that. So, they're all human beings, but some of them are really bad human beings.
Yeah, well, moral status is, of course, a very complicated thing and comes with degrees and levels and qualifications. And I mean, certainly, the murderer and the pedophile may have forfeited certain moral claims that ordinary people have. I'm not inclined to say they don't have moral status. I still think even even in these cases, these beings, one has to take their interests at least into account. There are limits on how one could treat them morally, but at the same time, they may have forfeited certain rights that ordinary human beings have. So they lack certain kinds of moral property. So I guess with respect to the big coarse-grained property of mattering morally, yes, they matter morally. Yeah, do they have full moral status? That's actually interesting. Do they have that would turn on the question about how fine-grainedly we measure full moral status, because there are certain moral properties they lack. More generally, I do think different conscious beings can have different moral status. And yeah, the case of humans versus dogs versus fish versus maybe flies and so on. I think it's not at all implausible that all those beings are conscious. But I don't think it's plausible that humans and flies have exactly the same moral status. So clearly we're going to have to make gradations of moral status in the space of conscious beings.
Pamela says, if phenomenal consciousness is phenomenal consciousness required for moral status, then does someone who once had it but now does not, for instance, somebody who's brain dead, have moral status?
That's a really interesting question. I guess the way it's often put is that what matters is not so much phenomenal consciousness, but the capacity for phenomenal consciousness. So while you're asleep, you're not conscious, but you've got the capacity to regain consciousness when you wake up. Or if someone's in a coma, then the thought will be, well, as long as they've got the capacity to regain consciousness, as many people do after a coma, then they still have moral status. But then there's these states like permanent or persistent vegetative state, where it's widely believed that at least some of these people don't have the capacity to regain consciousness. I guess on this view, if it's true that they don't have the capacity to regain consciousness, then they won't have moral status. But of course, it's very tricky. And there are some cases where people have thought that someone was in this permanent state and then turned out to be evidence that they could regain some degree of consciousness. So we have to be very careful there. But I guess in the case of brain death, the standard view of brain death would be that where there's brain death, there's not even the capacity for consciousness. If that's right, then those people don't have moral status.
Okay. Tanya earlier on was asking, what does our understanding of consciousness say about people with personality disorders?
With personality disorders?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, I guess I'd say prima facie, most people with personality disorders are still conscious, so they matter. It may well be that some people with personality disorders don't fully respect other people's consciousness. Part of what's said to be involved in, say, being a psychopath or a sociopath is a certain kind of absence of empathy for others. And empathy is a way of respecting, realizing, and inhabiting and respecting the conscious states of others. So it may well be that a lack of respect for the consciousness of others is part of what's involved in at least certain kinds of personality disorders that involve, certain kinds of harmful behavior.
Now, I knew that something like this question was going to come because, it's your fault. You mentioned the zombies. So the question from Chanel is, in the Walking Dead series, is it morally wrong for pre-turned humans to ask their teammates to end their lives upon turning into zombies? Do their post-turned zombies get to have their lives ended because their pre-turned conscious selves decided to?
That's a really great question. Although, I've thought a fair amount about zombies. I've really not watched The Walking Dead very much. I'm embarrassed to say. Maybe 1 or 2 episodes years ago, but I know it's moved a long way ahead since then. So I guess the first question to ask is, are the zombies in The Walking Dead conscious? Does anyone know?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know, because I have to say I haven't watched the series either.
If they're not conscious, they're just mere objects that we can manipulate, and doing this is fine. But yeah, if the zombies are themselves conscious, then maybe they get to have some moral rights, and humans shouldn't get to decide if they the complete decision over whether they live or die. Okay, we're going to need to get into complicated philosophy of The Walking Dead to settle this one.
All right, another question. I don't know the name of Bill. It looks like the name is in the chat. He's asking, so this is another one of these broad questions, but I think it's interesting to talk about it for a couple of minutes. Do the moral questions regarding consciousness run counter to David Hume's, is-ought gap? So this notion that if we're talking, all of this discussion is being predicated essentially on what eventually come down to be empirical, issues. Is a being conscious? Does it have affective consciousness or not? So, given that, are we in a sense deriving an ought from an is? I don't actually have a problem with that, but maybe you do.
Yeah, I'm happy to say there's an is-ought gap, but I think it's fairly plausible. There's no kind of purely straightforward derivation of ought facts or value facts from non-ought, non-value facts. In this case, it would just come up even at the level of the connection between being conscious and having moral status. I don't think there's any logical deduction of the form, this being is conscious, therefore they have value, they have moral status. The fact that consciousness has value, if indeed it's true, is somehow some kind of basic normative or basic evaluative fact here. So I wouldn't, there's no simple calculus. Even if you're a utilitarian, you say, well, the right thing to do always involves maximizing pleasure. I still think even for a utilitarian, there's no simple deduction straight from maximize pleasure to good. It also requires this further axiom, namely the axiom that utilitarianism is true, that goodness requires maximizing pleasure. And I think there's no getting away from that in ethical theories, even including this case.
There's a kind of a funny question by Olga. Why in all these trolley problems nobody discusses a driver, and a driver's status, the actual effect on the driver when he makes have to make the decision. And in fact, you mentioned The Good Place. In The Good Place, there is a scene where the driver is very much, the center of attention there.
Yeah, Chidi was traumatized.
Yeah, exactly.
He got splattered with blood and so on. In one of these cases, the human who was killed turned out to be his Australian friend, and it was like, yeah, this is very traumatic for the for Chidi and for the driver. But I guess the thought is, whatever the trauma is for the driver, what happens to them is not as bad as what's happening to these beings who are being killed. So maybe that ends up factoring in less.
Yeah. We have a couple more minutes. Chad, I see one of your questions in the chat, but you can actually unmute yourself and ask it live, so make it a little bit more varied.
Okay, I'll try my best to be quick. I was thinking about a trolley problem between a group of beings that have only pure sensory phenomenology, as opposed to a group of beings that have pure sensory phenomenology and affective phenomenology, if that's even conceivable. Let's just suppose it is for the sake of argument, right? My inclination is that given the complexity in the latter group, the more complex set of phenomenologies in the beings that have sensory and affective, that would make me want to just run over the pure sensory streamers as opposed to people with more complex phenomenologies. So I'm wondering if perhaps the real problem with the narrow sententialism that you set up is that they hang their hat completely on affective phenomenology. And if perhaps something like a wider variety of phenomenologies plays a role in influencing our intuitions here. But yeah, that's it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I guess this, sensory, affective, or cognitive kind of comes down to seeing or feeling or thinking. And yeah, it is an interesting question. Just say being can just see. It just has the experience of vision. Does this already put it in the moral circle or not? It's at least a reasonable view, I think, to say that it doesn't. I go back and forth on that. Certainly, I think seeing and feeling is a clearer case. I think if you feel, you're probably in the moral circle. I don't disagree with that claim. So I think if you see and feel, you're more clearly have moral status than if you merely see. But I actually think that the kind of phenomenology that matters the most is neither of those, but it's the cognitive kind. It's once a being can think, can reason, and desire, and so on. That's what that clearly puts them in the moral sphere. So I guess I don't have clear views about what has priority. I think if a being can think, consciously think, it's in the moral sphere. If it can consciously feel, it's in the moral sphere. If it can consciously see or perceive, it may be in the moral sphere. But I think, like you, I think sensory phenomenology is the least clear of the three cases. If someone takes the being that you could have sensory phenomenology while entirely lacking moral status, then we'd have to qualify our sentientism to say there's not just any form of phenomenal consciousness gives you moral status, but only certain forms. I guess I prefer the view where having sensory phenomenology gives you a little bit of moral status, but I agree the matter is far from clear.
All right, I think we're going to close it there. Thanks, Chad. Thank you, David. This was a very stimulating talk. You know, we're going to invite you on campus as soon as, you know, COVID permitting, so that you'll see our beautiful campus. It really is beautiful. It's worth seeing. So we'll find an excuse or another to get you over. So thanks again for coming tonight and for sharing your time with us.
Thanks for all the great discussion and the great questions. By the way, is there any way to save this chat? Looks like the discussion here is so great.
Oh yeah, we'll save it. Don't worry. and thanks for everybody. We had a peak about 240, 245 people in the room, so that was very nice. Thanks everybody. And before I let you go, I will just invite you to be back on Thursday, November 18, 2021, when we're going to have the 8th edition of Philosophy Day at City College. Of course, fate permitting, and whether that will be online or in person, that depends on the ongoing situation, evolving situation. Until then, stay safe and have a good night.